Have you ever felt a loneliness so deep that the silence itself seems to have weight? For one man, that silence was a fortress built around a wounded heart, in a cabin buried deep within a world of snow. But what happens when that fortress is shaken by the faintest sound imaginable? The last, fragile echo of a life about to be extinguished. This is their story. As we begin this journey together, if you believe tales of compassion and survival are worth telling, your support truly matters. A simple like helps this story find others, and by subscribing, you ensure that our future tales will always find their way to you. The silence was the first thing he noticed. Not the usual quiet of the Idaho panhandle, a gentle hush of wind through pine and the distant call of a jay, but a profound, heavy silence that only a world buried in snow could create. For 3 days, the blizzard had raged, a relentless assault of wind and blinding white. Now it was over. The sky was a sharp, brilliant blue, and the sun cast a painful glare across a landscape remade, sculpted into soft, immaculate dunes of white. Samuel Holloway stood on the porch of his cabin, the steam from his coffee cup rising in the frigid air. He was a man built like the mountains around him, lean and hard, with a quiet that seemed to run deeper than mere temperament. His face was weathered by the elements, and his eyes, a pale gray, held the weary distance of someone who had seen too much. As a former combat engineer, he was no stranger to harsh conditions, but the cacophony of men and machines had been replaced by this overwhelming stillness. He had chosen this solitude deliberately, a self-imposed exile to a place where the only sounds were those of nature. He pulled on his heavy winter gear, his movements economical and practiced. It was time to check his property line, to see what the storm had left in its wake. The snow was deep, sinking past his knees with every step, but he moved with a steady, determined rhythm. The world was pristine, a clean slate, yet he felt no peace in it, only a vast emptiness that mirrored his own. It was near the southern edge of his land, where a cluster of granite boulders formed a natural wall, that he saw them, tracks. They were small, almost lost in the deep powder, the desperate, stumbling prints of a small animal. His brow furrowed. It was unusual to see such signs after a storm this severe. Most creatures were smart enough to have hunkered down deep in their dens. Curiosity, an emotion long dormant in him, stirred faintly. He followed the tracks, his long strides easily covering the ground. They led him to a wide overhang of rock, a shallow cave whose entrance was nearly sealed by a drift of snow. A faint, almost imperceptible smell hung in the air, the scent of death, cold and final. He pushed aside the snow and peered into the darkness. His heart, a muscle he had long thought numb, gave a hard, painful jolt. Inside lay the still form of a large dog, her dark fur covered in a delicate filigree of frost. She was beautiful, clearly a German shepherd, her body curled around the frozen shapes of her puppies. She had tried to shield them, to give them her last warmth, but the storm had been too strong, too relentless. They were all gone. He was about to turn away, a familiar ache settling in his chest, when he saw it, a flicker of movement. From beneath the mother's stiff leg, one small form trembled, a tiny, convulsive shiver. He knelt, his knees sinking into the snow, and reached into the den. His gloved fingers brushed against soft fur. A whimper, so faint it was barely a sound, reached his ears. It was an echo of life in a tomb of ice. He gently pulled the puppy out. It was small, no bigger than his 2 hands put together, its black and tan coat matted with snow. Its eyes were sealed shut, and its body was terrifyingly cold, but it was breathing. A shallow, ragged breath, but it was there. He looked at the dead mother, then back at the shivering creature in his hands. He should leave it. That was the logical thing to do. It was the law of this wild place, a law he had come here to live by. He had sought isolation, a life free of attachments, free of the responsibility for another living soul. This creature, this tiny, fragile life, was a complication he did not need. He could walk away. He could return to his cabin, to his silence, and pretend he had seen nothing. But he couldn't. The soldier in him, the engineer who built things and fixed what was broken, wouldn't let him. He had seen enough death. He wouldn't leave another soul to perish if he could help it. With a quiet sigh that clouded the air before him, he unzipped his heavy coat, tucking the small, cold body against the warmth of his chest. He zipped the coat back up, creating a small, dark cocoon for his precious cargo. The journey back was different. He moved with a new purpose, a careful urgency. He was no longer just a man walking through the snow. He was a guardian, a protector. Each step was measured, his focus entirely on the fragile life he carried. Inside the cabin, the warmth of the wood stove was a welcome embrace. He laid the puppy on a soft wool blanket near the hearth, its tiny body still trembling. He worked quickly, warming water, finding an old dropper in his first aid kit. He spent the next hour patiently dripping warm, diluted milk into the puppy's mouth, watching for the small, reflexive swallows. As the small creature's shivering slowly subsided, replaced by a deeper, more regular breath, Sam sat back on his heels. He watched the firelight play over the puppy's dark fur. The silence of the cabin was no longer empty. It was filled with the presence of this small, tenacious survivor. He had found it because of its faint cry, a sound almost swallowed by the vast, snowy quiet. "Echo," Sam said aloud, his voice rough from disuse. "I'll call you Echo." It was a fitting name, for the puppy was an echo of a life that should have been lost, and its arrival was an echo of a part of himself he thought had died long ago. The months that followed were measured not by the calendar on the wall, but by the steady growth of the puppy at his feet. Winter held its grip on the Idaho mountains, but the ironclad silence of Sam's life had been broken, replaced by the soft patting of paws on the wooden floor and the occasional happy sigh from a sleeping dog. Echo was no longer the tiny, shivering creature Sam had pulled from the snow. He was a lanky, 3-month-old German shepherd, all clumsy paws and boundless energy, his black and tan coat growing thick and glossy. The sable darkness of his puppy fur was giving way to the rich, warm colors of his breed, a living flame against the stark white landscape outside. The rigid, empty routine Sam had built for himself had fractured, reforming around the needs of another. Mornings were no longer about silently enduring the dawn, but about a wet nose nudging him awake, followed by a trip outside where breath plumed in the cold air. His solitary treks to check the property line became expeditions. Echo, with an instinct that needed no teaching, would bound ahead, his oversized paws acting like natural snowshoes, leaving a trail of confident prints for Sam to follow. The pup's presence changed the very nature of the wilderness for Sam. It was no longer a place of hiding, but a world to be explored, to be shared. Sam, the engineer, approached training with methodical patience. He taught Echo to sit, to stay, to come. But Echo learned with an intelligence that was more like partnership than obedience. He didn't just respond to commands, he anticipated them. He watched Sam's every move, his amber eyes holding a deep, analytical focus that was startling in an animal so young. Sam had worked with dogs in the service, disciplined and loyal animals trained for specific tasks. Echo was different. There was a wild spark in his intelligence, a profound self-awareness forged in the crucible of his birth. He was a survivor, and he seemed to understand that Sam was one too. His endurance was remarkable. On their long walks through the silent, snow-laden forest, Sam would tire long before Echo did. The puppy would charge up steep, snow-covered inclines and navigate treacherous, icy patches with a preternatural grace, his powerful little body a testament to the strength of his bloodline. He was, in every sense, a creature of the mountains. The day came when Sam could no longer put it off. The small bag of puppy food he'd bought on a rare trip months ago was nearly empty, and more importantly, Echo needed his vaccinations. The thought of going to town, of interacting with people, sent a familiar cold dread through him. But one look at the trusting face looking up at him, and he knew he had to. For Echo. The drive into the small town of Clark Fork was tense. Sam kept his eyes fixed on the road, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. Echo sat in the passenger seat, not with the frantic energy of a normal puppy, but with a quiet, dignified calm, his gaze fixed on the passing scenery. His presence was a steadying anchor in the storm of Sam's anxiety. The veterinary clinic was a small, practical building run by a man named Ben Carter. Dr. Carter was in his late 50s, a man with a kind, weathered face and hands that were as gentle as they were strong. He moved with the unhurried efficiency of someone who had spent a lifetime caring for animals. He greeted Sam with a simple nod and turned his attention to the puppy. "Well now, who do we have here?" Ben said, his voice warm. "His name is Echo," Sam replied, his own voice feeling foreign in the quiet room. Ben lifted the puppy onto the examination table, his hands expertly checking his teeth, his ears, the structure of his bones. Echo, instead of squirming, stood perfectly still, submitting to the examination with a quiet trust. "He's in remarkable shape," Ben commented, listening to the puppy's heart with his stethoscope. "Strong heartbeat. Lungs are clear. You've done a good job with him." "I found him," Sam said, the words coming out before he could stop them. "Up in the mountains, after the big storm." He recounted the story in a few clipped sentences, describing the rock den and the frozen mother. Ben listened without interruption, his expression unreadable. When Sam finished, the vet was quiet for a long moment, his hand resting on Echo's back. He looked from the magnificent young dog to the haunted man standing beside him. "Well," Ben said finally, his voice soft but clear, "I can tell you he's a German shepherd, and a fine one at that. But whatever his papers might say, one thing is for sure." He looked directly at Sam, his eyes holding a deep, affirming wisdom. "He's built for these mountains, Sam." "Tough as an old pine." The words settled over Sam, not as a diagnosis or a simple observation, but as a validation. Ben wasn't just talking about the dog's physical strength. He was acknowledging his spirit, the incredible resilience that had allowed him to survive. He was saying that Echo belonged. Driving back to the cabin, with Echo sleeping peacefully in the seat beside him, Sam felt a profound sense of peace settle over him for the first time in years. The vet's words replayed in his mind. Tough as an old pine. He looked at his companion, this miracle of a dog, and knew that Ben was right. They were two survivors, two tough old pines standing together against the wind, leaving new footprints on the frozen ground. Another year had passed, turning the world from white to green and back to white again. Echo was no longer a lanky adolescent, but a fully grown German shepherd in his prime. He was magnificent, a powerful animal with a deep chest, intelligent amber eyes, and a noble bearing. His black and tan coat was thick, a perfect insulation against the Idaho cold. He moved with a silent, fluid grace that Sam never tired of watching, a creature perfectly in tune with the rhythm of the wilderness he called home. The bond between them had deepened from one of a rescuer and survivor to a partnership of equals, a silent understanding that transcended words. The emptiness in Sam's cabin, and in his heart, was a distant memory, filled now by the steady presence of his companion. One night, winter laid a hand of perfect stillness upon the land. The temperature had plummeted, and the air was so cold and clear it felt brittle, as if the world might shatter with a single sharp sound. There was no wind. A full moon hung in the black sky, casting a brilliant ethereal light over the snow-covered mountains, making the landscape look like a dream. Sam stood on the porch, watching his breath turn to silver mist, while Echo stood beside him, alert and watchful, his gaze sweeping across the silent moonlit forest. It was in this moment of profound peace that it happened. Echo lifted his head, his powerful neck arching. It began not as a sound, but as a low vibration in his chest, a deep thrumming that Sam could feel even standing a foot away. Then the sound rose. It was not the sharp, percussive bark of a dog, nor was it the familiar, yipping howl of the coyotes that sometimes hunted in the lower valleys. This was something else entirely. It was a long, sonorous call, a sound that seemed to be pulled from the very core of the earth. It was haunting and deeply mournful, yet threaded with a note of fierce, untamed joy. It flowed out across the frozen landscape, a primitive melody that spoke of ancient forests, of starlit skies, and of a profound, wild solitude. It was the sound of the wilderness itself, given a voice. Sam stood frozen, not in fear, but in absolute awe. He had lived here long enough to have heard the distant, ghostly calls of the local wolf packs on rare occasions. He knew their song. This was not it. This sound was different, imbued with a unique character, with the soul of the animal it came from. The call rose to a crescendo, held for a long, vibrating moment against the silent stars, and then slowly faded, leaving behind a silence even more profound than before. In that quiet, a truth settled over Sam, a realization that was as clear and cold as the night air. It was not a shock, not a sudden revelation, but rather the final, clear confirmation of something he had felt deep in his bones for a long time. The papers from the vet and the evidence of his own eyes said that Echo was a German shepherd, a domestic dog. But that sound, that ancient, primal call, told a different story. It spoke of Echo's spirit. This was not simply a dog he had saved. This was a creature who had been born of the storm and the silence, who had survived when all others had perished. The forest was not just his home, it was in his blood, in his soul. He was a dog with the heart of the wild, a paradox of loyalty and untamable spirit. The wildness Sam had seen in his eyes as a puppy was not just a spark of intelligence, but the burning ember of this ancient, powerful essence. He was a creature of two worlds, and Sam was his anchor, the only human who would ever truly understand him. Echo turned his head and looked at Sam, his amber eyes seeming to glow in the moonlight. There was no challenge in his gaze, only a quiet question, as if seeking acceptance for the part of himself he had just revealed. And in his own heart, Sam felt no fear at all. On the contrary, he felt a surge of love so fierce and protective it took his breath away. This was Echo, all of him. The loyal companion who slept at the foot of his bed, and the wild spirit who sang to the moon. They were two survivors, two lonely souls who had found each other in the frozen wastes. He reached out and laid a hand on Echo's thick fur, a silent promise passing between them. He would protect him, not just his life, but his spirit. He would be the guardian of this secret, this beautiful, wild truth. Here, in their mountain sanctuary, Echo would always be free to be who he was, to answer the call of his wild heart. Under the silent, watching eyes of the moon, a pact was sealed, a pact not of master and pet, but of two kindred souls, bound together by the old magic of the forest. The deep green of summer gave way to the fiery golds and reds of autumn. The air grew crisp, and the scent of pine and damp earth sharpened. For Sam, this season had always been one of quiet beauty, a slow, peaceful descent into the long sleep of winter. But this year, a new sound carried on the wind, a sound that chilled him more than any frost, the distant, sporadic crack of a hunting rifle. It was a reminder that they were no longer alone in these mountains. The pact he had made with Echo, the quiet sanctuary he had built, was now vulnerable to the outside world. The intrusion came on a Tuesday. Sam was splitting firewood when he noticed them, tracks that were not his own, cutting across the northern edge of his property. They were the deep, aggressive tread of an ATV, a blatant disregard for the solitude of this place. A cold knot tightened in his stomach. He had spent his life learning to read the ground, to understand the story it told, and this story was one of carelessness and intrusion. He called Echo to his side, his voice low and firm, and led him back inside the cabin, his eyes scanning the dense tree line. An hour later, the guttural roar of an engine grew louder, culminating in the arrival of an ATV at the edge of his clearing. 2 men dismounted. The one who seemed to be in charge, a wiry man named Mark, had a sharp, ferret-like face and eyes that darted everywhere, assessing, calculating. His partner, Dale, was bigger, a heavy-set man with a sullen expression who said nothing, his gaze lingering on the cabin with a vacant sort of menace. Both wore camouflage and carried rifles slung over their shoulders with casual familiarity. "Afternoon," Mark called out, his smile not reaching his eyes. "Didn't think anyone lived this far back." Sam stood on his porch, his posture rigid, his face a mask of neutrality. Echo was at his side, not growling, but standing tall and still, a low thrum of warning vibrating in his chest. "I like my privacy," Sam said, his tone flat and unwelcoming. "Can't blame you there," Mark said, his eyes flicking from Sam to the magnificent dog beside him. "We were just tracking a bit. Saw some mighty big prints back in the woods. Figured it had to be a wolf, maybe a big one." He paused, letting the statement hang in the air. "Do you see any big wolves around here? It's hunting season." The question was a baited hook. Sam could feel the pressure of it, the way they were watching him, gauging his reaction. "There are wolves in these mountains," he answered evenly, giving them nothing. "They keep to themselves?" "Right," Mark chuckled, a dry, unpleasant sound. "Well, that explains the tracks, I guess." His gaze dropped to Echo again, a new light in his eyes, a mixture of surprise and something uglier, something like arrogant dismissal. "That's one hell of a big dog you got there. A shepherd, is he?" "He is," Sam said. "You ought to keep him tied up." Dale, the silent one, grunted unexpectedly, his voice a low rumble. Mark held up a hand. "Now, Dale, he's on his own land. But my friend's got a point," he said, turning his unsettling smile back on Sam. "A lot of folks round here get jumpy. They shoot first and ask questions later when they see something that big running loose in the woods. Especially," he added, his voice dropping slightly, "when it might have some wolf in it. You never know." There it was, the veiled threat, the insinuation that gave them license to be reckless. They weren't just hunters. They were bullies, men who believed their rifles gave them authority over the forest and everything in it. Sam's hand rested on Echo's head, a silent signal for him to remain calm. "He's just a dog," Sam said, his voice dropping to a low, cold register that held its own kind of threat. "And he stays on my land. Now, if you're done, I have work to do." The hunters exchanged a look. Mark gave another one of his thin smiles, tipped his head in a mock salute, and they climbed back on their ATV, its engine roaring to life and shattering the peace as they sped away. The moment they were gone, the quiet that returned was different. It was fragile, tainted. The sanctuary had been breached. Sam went inside and locked the door, a gesture he hadn't made in over a year. He looked at Echo, who was watching him intently, sensing the shift in his human. The world had shrunk. The vast wilderness that had been their playground was now a place of unseen threats. From that day on, their lives were governed by a new, tense vigilance. The long, exploratory walks were over. Every trip outside was now a tactical exercise. Sam, the combat engineer, resurfaced. He studied maps, planned their routes, sticking to the dense, less accessible parts of his land, away from trails and logging roads. He moved with a heightened awareness he hadn't needed since his time overseas, listening for the snap of a twig, the distant sound of an engine, anything that was out of place. He taught Echo hand signals for down and silent, and the dog responded with uncanny understanding. They were a silent team, moving like ghosts through their own forest. Sam was no longer just a man seeking peace. He was a soldier on watch, a guardian standing sentinel over a precious life. They were living on a thin line, a fragile boundary between the quiet pact they had made with the forest and the careless violence of men, and Sam knew he would do whatever it took to keep from crossing it. The tense vigilance became their new reality. Sam and Echo moved through the autumn forest like shadows, their bond deepened by the shared threat. The hunters, Mark and Dale, had not been seen again, but their presence lingered like a poison in the air. Sam knew men like them. Their pride, once pricked, could easily fester into obsession. He remained on high alert. It was Dale, the silent, brooding one, who broke. The image of the huge, defiant dog and his quiet owner had burrowed under his skin. It became a personal affront, an unspoken challenge to his skill as a hunter. Ignoring Mark's advice to leave it be, he set out alone one morning, convinced he could track the animal and prove his dominance over the wilderness. He moved with a hunter's arrogance, pushing deeper into the unfamiliar territory, his eyes scanning for tracks, his focus narrowed to a single obsessive point. He was so intent on his quarry that he failed to notice the sky changing, the light growing flat and gray, the wind picking up with a sudden vicious bite. By the time the first flakes of snow began to fall, he was already hopelessly lost. The snow came down not as a gentle flurry, but as a blinding, disorienting squall, wiping out landmarks and his own trail back. Panic began to claw at him. He hurried his pace, moving recklessly over the treacherous, snow-covered ground. It was a single misstep, a foot placed on a patch of ice hidden beneath the fresh powder, that sealed his fate. His leg twisted beneath him with a sickening crack, and he tumbled into a shallow, rocky ravine, the world exploding in a starburst of white-hot pain. He lay there, gasping, the cold seeping into him with alarming speed. He tried to move, but the agony in his broken leg was absolute. He was alone, injured, and a blizzard was closing in. This is how it ends, he thought, a wave of cold despair washing over him. He didn't know how much time had passed when a shape appeared on the ridge above him, a dark silhouette against the swirling white. It was the dog, Echo. Dale's heart seized with primal fear. He was helpless, cornered. The animal just stood there, watching him, its head cocked. Dale braced himself for the attack, for the final, brutal end. But it never came. Instead, the dog lifted its magnificent head, and the sound that Dale had only heard rumors of from Mark now filled the air. It was the howl. A long, powerful, soul-shaking call that cut through the roar of the wind. It wasn't a sound of aggression. It was a clear, ringing beacon, a continuous, urgent summons. It was an alarm. Miles away, on their own carefully chosen route, Sam heard it. He stopped dead, his head snapping up. It was Echo's call, the one he had heard on that moonlit night. But this time, it was different. It lacked the mournful quality, the quiet joy. This was sharp, insistent, and repeated. It was a signal. Sam's years of training took over. He pinpointed the direction of the sound and began to run, his own powerful strides eating up the ground, his only thought to get to Echo. He found them less than 20 minutes later. The scene in the ravine was surreal. The injured hunter, pale and shivering on the ground, and on the ridge above, his faithful dog, still calling out, a living lighthouse in the storm. "Echo, enough! Heel!" Sam commanded as he slid down the embankment. Echo fell silent immediately and trotted to Sam's side, his duty done. Sam didn't waste a second. He knelt beside Dale, his movements swift and professional. The break was clean but bad. Hypothermia was already setting in. "Don't try to talk," Sam ordered, his voice leaving no room for argument. He worked quickly, cutting away the man's pant leg, using 2 sturdy branches and strips of his own flannel shirt to fashion a crude but effective splint. He got his emergency blanket out of his pack and wrapped it tightly around the shivering man. Dale could do nothing but lie there, his teeth chattering, and watch as the man he had threatened, the man whose peace he had tried to destroy, worked to save his life. His gaze shifted from Sam's focused face to the dog sitting stoically beside him. Echo watched the proceedings with his intelligent amber eyes, a silent, powerful guardian. The fear in Dale's heart was replaced by something else, something heavy and unfamiliar. It was a profound, crushing shame, mingled with a bewildering sense of gratitude. It took hours, an agonizing journey of shared weight and gritted teeth, for Sam to get Dale back to a logging road where Mark eventually found them. Not many words were exchanged. Mark's face was a mask of shock and relief, and Dale, humbled by pain and his own foolishness, couldn't meet Sam's eyes. He gave one last look at Echo, a look of awe and deep respect, before being helped away. They never came back. The secret of the man and his dog in the Idaho mountains was safe, protected not by fences or threats, but by a life given back. That evening, the storm had passed. The world was once again draped in a blanket of pristine white. Sam and Echo stood on the porch, looking out at the silent, sleeping mountains. The air was clean. The silence was whole again. The echo that Sam had found in the snow had called out into the wilderness, and its call had returned, not with violence, but with salvation. It had saved the life of an enemy, and in doing so, had secured their own peace. Sam rested his hand on Echo's head, and they stood together, two survivors, their pact with the wild sealed forever. In the end, the story of Sam and Echo is a quiet reminder that a home is not always a place built of wood and stone, but a bond forged in loyalty that can heal the deepest wounds. Their journey in the mountains of Idaho has found its peaceful conclusion, but the world is full of such silent echoes of courage and connection. If you wish to continue this journey with us and be here for every one of those stories, we hope you'll subscribe and become a part of our community, so you never have to miss a moment.